And so, of course, the other big MMA story that we have to talk about, and I think that this was the one that was, intuitively, this should have been the big story from this past weekend. But unfortunately, the controversy with Jan and Sterling, did overshadow this a little bit. But coming out of UFC 259 at the Las Vegas Apex, I don't think that a lot of people actually saw this coming. But Jan Blachowicz is still the UFC light heavyweight champion of the world. And I have to tell you, as much as I like Israel Adesanya, as much as there was a certain appeal to see him winning that match and becoming the quote-unquote champ squared, I don't at all mind seeing Jan Blachowicz give him his first L. In reality, I think that one way or another, this was something that had to happen. I think that one way or another, this is something that has to happen to almost every undefeated fighter, unless your name happens to be Khabib. I mean, there are a lot of ways that people look at the records of undefeated fighters. A lot of people look at those records and they see that this is a dominant fighter. And that's all that they see there. But in the presence of that O, in the absence of another number after that dash, there's arguably something else there that a lot of people don't really notice very much or pay very much attention to. It's not really the presence of something, it is the absence of something else. That thing is adversity. I'm not going to say that any fighter who has never lost, has never faced adversity in their life or in their fighting career. But one thing that I will say for absolutely certain is that adversity, it does not show up in their record. You have to go elsewhere looking for that adversity. And so, in the case of Khabib Nurmagomedov, to find that adversity, you have to go looking outside of that record, and particularly in his last fight against Justin Gaethje, of course, that adversity was the passing of his father. The passing of his father and his head coach. And he still managed to come back and stay undefeated at 29-0. That's fantastic. Now, the reason why I tell you that is just specifically to make it clear that the record doesn't always tell the full story. But let's take a look at a fighter whose record tells a lot more of the full story than perhaps Khabib Nurmagomedov's record. And of course, that is the light heavyweight champion of the world, Jan Blachowicz. So at 28-8, the amount of adversity that Jan Blachowicz has gone through in his career shows up a lot more clearly than it does in Israel Adesanya's record of 20-1, or of course Khabib Nurmagomedov's record of 29-0. And it's one thing to have all of the trappings of a great fighting career without ever having to face that amount of adversity. But to have all of that and to have overcome that adversity, I think that says two very different things about a fighter. I think that it would be foolish. It would be a ridiculous thing to say, that anybody can be an undefeated fighter, but that it takes a different kind of fighter to come back from having a loss, from having a large number of losses. Jan Blachowicz has definitely had to overcome a lot of adversity in his career. If you want to look at when there was the there's no doubt about it that Jan Blachowicz has had to overcome some adversity in his career. If you want the best example of that, you don't need to look any further than between the years 2015 and 2017. That was when his career looked the absolute darkest. Over that period of time, he lost 4 out of 5 of his fights. Today, he's the light heavyweight champion of the world. I mean, it wasn't a quick or easy ascension for him. Over the next 4 years, he had to win 8 out of his next 9 fights. Sorry, it took me a moment to remember that number. But he had to win 8 out of 9 of his next fight to become the light heavyweight champion of the world. Oh, and also Jon Jones had to make the decision that he was going to move on to what he thinks are greener pastures. Now, speaking of Jon Jones is acting the exact way that you would expect Jon Jones to act And in all honesty, given that he isn't the one who actually did the damage in this particular case, I don't think that this reflects very well on him. But he's basically come out and he said that, the Jones-Adesanya fight, that's off. He's saying that Israel Adesanya, quote-unquote, isn't even worth his time. He's basically acting like Israel Adesanya having that 1 next to the 20 in his record, basically makes him ineligible to fight Jon Jones. Which is a very peculiar attitude, I think, for a guy that happens to have a 1 next to the 26 in his record. And even if he didn't have that 1 next to the 26, let's be honest with ourselves here for one moment. If Jon Jones's record were 26-0, he would have asterisks next to some of those fights at 26. He would have asterisks next to that 26. Multiple. So Jon Jones has no business trying to treat Israel Adesanya as if he's an unworthy opponent. But unfortunately, Jon Jones doesn't seem to be the only person who's acting in this way. Even Dana White in the UFC, Israel Adesanya's pound-for-pound ranking took a very severe hit this week. At this stage, Dana White isn't really talking about that Jones versus Adesanya fight anymore. Really, nobody is. And I think that anybody who was writing Adesanya out of the quote-unquote GOAT sweepstakes at this particular point, they're doing themselves a huge disservice. Because now that he has broken his 20-fight winning streak, now that he's no longer an undefeated fighter, really, what is ahead for Israel Adesanya? Obviously, other than defending his middleweight championship of the world, and that is just simple. Is that he gets to rebuild. He gets to ask those questions of himself. How did I lose this fight? He gets to find the weaknesses in his fighting style and in his fighting technique. He gets to correct them. He gets to come back. He gets to move forward, and he gets to avenge that loss. And the simple fact of the matter is that there's anybody out there right now who thinks that Israel Adesanya can't do it. Well, Jan Blachowicz should be laughing his ass off at them right now. The hole that Israel Adesanya has to climb his way out of, if you could call it a hole at all, is not nearly as deep or as dark as the one that Jan Blachowicz climbed himself out of starting in 2017. So if Jan Blachowicz could do it, who honestly thinks that Israel Adesanya could not do it? I understand that there are probably not a lot of people out there that see this way. But what this fight has really done is it has given Israel Adesanya a gift. It has given him a loss that is going to teach him a new way to win. It's given him an opportunity to take his lumps like a man with dignity and come back stronger than he was before. Now, from the way that he comported himself after his loss to Jan Blachowicz on Saturday night, Israel Adesanya, he has already done the first of these things. Now all he has to do is do the second one. And I would not ever want to stand in the shoes of anybody who thinks that Israel Adesanya can't do this.